The next chapter, the next reading here is from chapter 3. And this is certainly a very fun chapter because we have some kids in the room here, and you guys are our future. Right back here. You're going to leave this country in about 20 years?
Totally.
Yes? Yes, you are. Maybe 15 years. Who knows? I got to hand the keys over to you guys. We got to have you ready. So this is from the chapter Confidence of Youth. Outside military conflicts, perhaps our nation's biggest challenge was the race to put man on the moon. John F. Kennedy's 1962 address in Houston regarding the space race was the public call to action following his 1961 speech to the joint session of Congress on May 25th. He said, "First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." President Kennedy's call to action did more than motivate a nation. It laid the foundation for a generation of America's youth that followed and set an example of thinking outside the box and challenging limitations of what was possible in space and elsewhere. The Apollo space program was a huge undertaking. Apollo 11 was the mission that became famous when, on July 20th, 1969, a man stepped onto the moon for the first time during a live television broadcast. To celebrate the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 moon landing, the British Broadcasting Company produced a podcast, 13 Minutes to the Moon, in 2019. It's notable for a fantastic compilation of interviews from the people who took part in the launch. Season 1 chronicled the challenges and events that saved the nearly disastrous Apollo 11 landing and the people involved who made that landing happen. Episode 11 features the final 13 minutes of recordings from the astronauts and the mission control team as the lunar module made its descent to the moon's surface. It's breathtaking, like the actual conversations they were having. It's fantastic. Season 2 chronicled the events and incredible survival of the astronauts on the infamous Apollo 13 mission, which nearly ended in tragedy after an explosion took place shortly after the crew reached space. The interviews with the astronauts themselves are some of the most priceless examples of human endurance and resolve ever recorded. The challenges they faced and the way the mission control team responded is perhaps the biggest story of human ingenuity in the face of adversity in American history. While the world watched anxiously, the Apollo 13 crew returned safely to Earth, fighting incredible odds. Critical to the success of these missions and behind the scenes were the men and women in mission control during launch. Mission control was ultimately responsible for the operation, safety, and life support functions, and the chief flight director was the only one who gave go or no-go orders for launch. What is most impressive about the Apollo program was the average age of the Apollo mission control team. So this is the control team that put man on the moon. Let me get some guesses. What was the average age of these kids? It's close. 27 years old. You put man on the moon right now. You're 26 years old. That's crazy. And that's what this chapter is all about. In today's world, jobs of this importance would have a room full of 30 or 40-something-year-old veteran rocket scientists. However, this young team was responsible for executing one of mankind's most daunting challenges, handling a total combined budget of over $25 billion, which today is $165 billion. At 26, 27 years old. It's hard to imagine the responsibility and pressures this team was under. Not only was the entire world watching, but they also faced mounting political pressure and the responsibility for 3 lives strapped into a rocket every time they hurled it towards the moon. It's pretty mind-boggling. One individual was a 26-year-old mission control specialist by the name of Steve Bales, described by flight director Gene Kranz as the original computer nerd. This guy was the first. He had owl-rimmed glasses and a baby face. Steve was from small-town Iowa, a town of 500 people. He became interested in the space program after watching a Disney special in the 1950s. A Disney special. The Disney special planted a seed in his imagination, which germinated and was nurtured by families and teachers. Steve decided to pursue a degree in engineering and at the age of 26, faced one of the most critical decisions in NASA's history, a real tip-of-the-spear type moment on the mission control team. There were only seconds to go before the most famous landing in the history of mankind when the team encountered a 1202 alarm code. Neil Armstrong relayed the code to message control with uncharacteristic urgency. Everyone in the room looked to Steve Bales, the 26-year-old kid. What did this alarm code mean? Was it critical enough to abort the moon landing? The entire mission and the lives of the astronauts rested on his hands. Steve's job was to understand the computer systems and alarm codes, the onboard computer with less computing power than the phones that we carry in our hands today. So everybody, just take out your phone and look at it. Like, more computing power than what put man on the moon. Without proper computer functioning, the landing could not happen, and everyone knew it. With the alarm code flashing and the ever-present memory of the loss of the Apollo 1 crew not far from their minds, the suspense in mission control could not be overstated. Ask yourself, what were you doing when you were 26 years old? Would you have been able to handle that kind of pressure? When I was 26 years old, I was an intern doctor in Akron, Ohio, and petrified by my first night on call. I was responsible for making decisions that could possibly kill someone. If I made a mistake with a medication dosage or misinterpreted an EKG, it would have disastrous effects. But I always had a senior resident or attending physician to call for guidance. The biggest decision I had was whether or not to call for help. Don't be afraid to call for help. There was also the additional backup from experienced nursing staff who were always on the prowl for dumb intern orders. These nurses were always prepared to rescue the patients from certain death. Even though one of my mistakes could have disastrous consequences, the system was set up to help me and guide me to the correct answer, unless I was too foolish to recognize my own limitations. So as a professor at Duke, this is what I would talk to with residents all the time. This is one of my sayings. Doctors don't kill people. Idiot doctors who don't know their limitations kill people. At that moment, in mission control, Steve Bales had no such backup. There was nobody to bail him out. The entire mission rested on his guidance and interpretation of these computer alarms. Luckily, Steve Bales had the confidence of youth. He wasn't afraid to take on tasks that had never been done before. He wasn't paralyzed by fear or realized that he couldn't do it. So he just did it. So that's you guys. Steve Bales' story serves as an incredible example of why investment in our youth is so critical to the future of our nation. Steve Bales later described how some people would hem and haw over decisions, asking themselves if they should do this or that. He didn't have the luxury of time. He made the decision, and the result is literally history. The lunar module landed safely onto the moon with Neil Armstrong's iconic words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The weight behind Steve's spear came from friends, family, and teachers in rural Iowa. When Americans take the time to be the weight behind the spear and ask the next generation to solve the problems of the future, which many times was created by that earlier generation, we have to believe they can do it because they believe that things can't be solved, and it empowers them to think outside the box. The confidence of youth allows their minds to work differently, to freely come up with solutions that older colleagues might not fathom. They aren't jaded by prior experiences nor by the limitations and unrecognized biases that handcuff the older generation. Every single child in this country is potentially the next Steve Bales or the next Neil Armstrong. So that's pretty powerful, very, very powerful. But that's what we expect of you guys. Because in the 60s, not much older than you put man on the moon. It's quite insane when you actually think about that age. Oh my goodness.